The Fellowship, spotted in Aragorn, have their hopes of escape dashed at the Gwathlo River as the screech of a fell beast is heard overhead, and 6 Nazgul land on the far side in Dunland, including the dread Lord of the Ring Wraiths. The Dark Power player had the luck of spotting part of the Fellowship as well as having enough shadow points to take advantage of that. And he moved 6 Nazgul, including the Lord of the Nazgul, into the hex in which Gandalf the Grey, Legolas, Boromir, and 2 unknown hobbits were spotted. When you have groups of opposing characters in individual combat, the battle is resolved one character at a time, and once you put a character up into combat, he must stay there until he perishes or all the enemies are defeated. So for instance, if I put the Lord of the Nazgul, which is my best, most powerful character, up in the front, he would likely be worn down fighting all of these other characters. But since the person that has to choose first is the person with the fewer characters, and the Fellowship has 5, and the Dark Power player had enough 12 shadow points, almost his maximum for the turn, nearly, and moved in 6 Nazgul. So the Fellowship will have to select which character will fight first. And this kind of makes some verisimilitude sense in that they are outnumbered, and so the small tactical advantage goes to the Nazgul. And the reason that matters who goes first is because there's 2 obvious choices for the Fellowship. It's either Boromir, because you want him dead before he can try to seize the ring, or Gandalf the Grey, because you want him dead so he comes back as Gandalf the White. But Nazgul can only be permanently injured with elven swords or sorcery. And the Dark Power player is guessing, hoping that this Fellowship has no elven swords. There's only 3 in the game. But Gandalf the Grey does have sorcery, and a pretty effective sorcery value of B. It goes from A through D, A being the best, D being pretty bad. So if the Nazguls had to pick first and picked like a weak, it would give the advantage. The Fellowship player could decide, well, do I want to use Gandalf's sorcery to eliminate these characters? And he especially would if the Dark Power player put up the Lord of the Nazgul first, who has a better combat rating as well as some sorcery of his own. But he has a better combat rating than any of the other Nazgul, and he might very well slay all these other characters, and even if he takes wounds, they won't be permanent because they lack elven swords or sorcery. And so if the Dark Power player had to pick first and he picked Lord of the Nazgul, the Fellowship player could throw down Gandalf the Grey and do him permanent injury and possibly even kill the Lord of the Nazgul, which would be very bad for the longer term game, as this is the best military commander the Dark Power player has. And how sorcery works is normally each side would roll on the individual combat table based on their relative difference of combat potential. If you're either -1 if you are worse than your opponent, or minus some value, or plus some value if you're greater. And this chart, it is possible every time you roll, even if you are advantaged, like +2 to your opponent, this left-hand side are the wounds that you take as the attacker, and the right-hand side are the wounds you deal. So even if you're at +2 or +1, you have a 50% chance of taking a wound yourself, which isn't, always the greatest. But instead of doing that, if you have sorcery, you can choose to roll on the sorcery table. And the sorcery table is just a straight up die roll D6, and it is the number of wounds you inflict on your opponent. And both Gandalf the Grey and Lord of the Nazgul have a B sorcerer rating. So, on a 1 they do 0, on a 6 they do 3 wounds to the opponent, and 1 or 2 on, average. So they're doing a pretty decent amount of average damage, and more importantly, they aren't quote unquote self-inflicting any wounds. And the individual combat chart is a death spiral because part of your combat potential is your endurance, which is also your hits that you can take. So every time you take a wound, your combat potential goes down. Your differential with your opponent probably goes down unless you inflicted an equal or greater number of wounds on your opponent, and it just gets worse and worse and worse. So sorcery can be very powerful in individual combat, but the lesson of the Battle of WotR is do not fight wizards. As Gandalf the Grey succeeded in defeating all 6 Nazgul, including the Lord, he is down to but 1 health point, which is somewhat unfortunate for the Fellowship, as he would like to come back as Gandalf the White, but they would also like Gandalf to be around to activate the Rohirrim. Boromir led the battle and fell after inflicting a few wounds to a Nazgul. But all of these Nazgul, all but one, the Nazgul 4, was eliminated with sorcery. That's what the X's mean. But all these others took wounds that were not sorcery or elven swords, and they're simple slashes. And these Nazgul will reform and remove these slash wounds, but not the X ones inflicted with sorcery. If the Dark Power player expands yet more shadow points to move them back to a Dark Power Citadel. And the Lord almost perished. He took 4 of his 6 wounds as sorcery and only 2 as healable damage. So he will probably never enter into individual combat again unless it's to seize the ring. On turn 3, the ring bearer and friends arrived at Lothlorien, whereupon Galadriel gifted them 2 magic items, Glamdring, an elven sword, and Shadowfax, a horse that allows 8 movement points instead of the normal 5, although only 1 character plus a hobbit can ride at a time. Both of these were given to Aragorn. Dark Power player returned most of his Nazgul, all but 1, to Dol Guldur or Barad-dûr, where they healed their wounds they suffered. On turn 4, the Dark Power player drew and played this event card, Pipeweed Cache Discovered, which prevents any group, including hobbits, from moving more than 2 hexes this turn, which is bad for the Fellowship. Slowing them down slowing down the Fellowship towards getting to the Mount Doom is what the Dark Power player needs to do in order to have time to mobilize his armies and forces to both take over the military objectives and to spread out and provide units to search for and capture the Ringbearer as he approaches Mordor. The Fellowship player drew another event card, which is mostly useful for the Dark Power player. All in all, got diced by the Grey Wizard.